slc.dlsph@fvtoronto.ca, as well as we do ask that while the speakers are presenting, you stay muted and use the raise hand function if you would like to speak during the Q&A portion of today's workshop. We also ask that you please respect the speakers and other participants and do not record or screenshot without permission. Again, we ask that you please share any questions that you may have in the comments section or the chat room. And I will be minding the chat room, and please feel free again to introduce yourself and continue letting us know where you're all coming from today. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to our speakers, Megan, Joyce, and Michelle.
Thanks so much, Lauren. So Michelle will be sharing her slides with her computer. So we'll just give her a second. Fantastic. Okay, so we're good there. Everybody can see. And that's really nice of everyone to drop in the chat where they're joining from. I'm also joining from Toronto. So our presentation today is on a topic that we're calling A Healthy Society Needs a Healthy Democracy. And in this presentation, we're going to be explaining how our voting system affects public health in numerous ways. So Joyce is going to go ahead and introduce our organization, Fair Vote Canada, for us.
Yes, Fair Vote Canada organization with its main mandate to promote proportional representation at all levels of government. And so although we tend to be critical of health policy, we are nonpartisan. Thanks. Back to you, Megan.
Okay. Great. So Michelle, just pop us to the outline. Fantastic. So just a note today, we will be sharing these slides with you after, anyone who's interested, so you don't need to take notes. If you do have questions at any time, just jot them down and we'll open up the floor for questions at a few intervals throughout the presentation to give you a chance to ask questions. So here's an outline of what we're going to be covering today. So firstly, a bit of a background on our healthcare system and the social determinants of health. Next, we're going to be explaining our current electoral system, which is something called first past the post, talking about how it works and its implications for our health system, health funding, and social system funding. And then we're going to introduce a solution, which is a different voting system called proportional representation. Also talk about how that works, that can be tricky, and its implications for our health system. Then we'll open it up for a few discussion questions at the end, in which we'll go into breakout rooms. Fantastic. So Joyce, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Our goal is to help you connect some dots and get back to first causes on questions about the health of Canadians. And we're sure by the end of the presentation, you will agree with us that the health of Canadians is very much affected upstream by the system we use to vote. Next slide. The Canadian Universal Healthcare System began when a young Scottish immigrant hurt his leg badly. When complications set in, doctors told his parents that the affordable solution was to amputate the leg. Fortunately, an orthopedic surgeon offered to treat him for free if medical students could observe the operation. Tommy Douglas was the name of that boy, and he decided then and there that a boy should not lose his leg due to lack of money. Okay, next one. In 1966, Tommy Douglas, now leader of the federal CCF, about to become NDP party, supported a minority Liberal government under Lester Pearson in creating universal health care in Canada. By that time, the Progressive Conservative under Diefenbaker were also on side. Next. 54 years later, Canada does well in international rankings of world healthcare systems. Based on criteria such as universal access, total government expenditures on health, and patient satisfaction, Canada came 30th out of 190 countries in a 2019 WHO ranking, putting it in the top 6th. But behind the healthcare system itself is another health story, which concerns the living conditions of Canadians. The most well-known and widely published author on this story is Dennis Raphael, professor of health policy at York University. He names 14 factors which comprise the living conditions of Canadians. They are known as the social determinants of health and include poverty, housing, education, early childhood development, race, gender, food security, income distribution, employment, working conditions. And it is here that Canada compares unfavorably with other countries in supporting its citizens as they navigate the lifespan. Next. Okay. We will look at some country comparisons later, but as we look at how our electoral system works, we can have in mind this question. If we agree that it is the responsibility of governments to use tax dollars provided by citizens to support the citizens' well-being, and Canada is doing a less or even far less than optimal job at doing this, what is the problem? Next slide. Canada is a representative democracy. Voters send politicians to Ontario or Ottawa to represent their needs and their values. For this arrangement to function well, we need elections that are free, fair, and provide accurate results. This means that every vote counts equally, and that after an election, the bodies where decisions are made reflect our will as expressed at the ballot box. In Canada, this is not the case. Election results are distorted and advantage some voices over others. Next slide. Why do we get these distorted results? These pie charts show 3 federal elections. The top row shows how the vote was distributed among the 3 parties. The bottom row shows how the votes translated into seats. Take special note of 2011 and 2015. In 2011, you can see the vote gave the Conservatives less than a majority of seats, and yet look at the less than the number of votes, and then look at the number of seats in the bottom row. They got a much larger portion of the seats than they had actually earned in the vote. In 2019, we have basically what was considered a landslide of Liberals, and yet look at the distribution of the vote as opposed to the distribution of, I was looking at 2015 was the landslide. You can see there at the top row how the voters voted, and then at the bottom how many seats the Liberals actually got, and that's was considered a landslide. And then 2019, as we all know, turned into a minority government. But also looking at these slides, it's very interesting to notice what happens to the other parties. Notice the orange and the green parties in particular. In all 3 of these elections, we can see, well, especially in 2015 and 2019, those parties are cheated. So it's at the expense of those parties that the winners of the elections are gaining more than their fair proportion of seats. And this is where we get distorted results that fail to represent the will of Canadians as they have expressed it at the ballot box. And they are not, all those voters are not at the policy table when decisions about their health and well-being are made. So next slide, Megan.
Great. Okay, so this first past the post, basically, as Joyce has just described, we've showed how, despite the fact that we have this perception of progressivity in Canada, we're actually benefiting these sort of center parties, the entrenched parties, and are essentially a 2-party system in this country. So Joyce, did you want to go through the slide with the pictures about how it works, the writings?
Yes, well, I'll just make another comment about this one. It's interesting to think of our federal elections as basically 338 separate races. It's not one race, it's 338 separate ones. And in each of those races, the party that wins the most votes, you know, it's called winner take all, takes the seat, and all the other votes basically don't count. So that gives you already an inkling of how this system actually at the technical level functions to disenfranchise a large number of voters. So yes, next slide. Here's, for example, 6 ridings. And in each of the 6 ridings, you have blue, pink, and yellow parties running. And notice the first 5, because of the plurality voting, the blue party took all of the seats. Actually, these show majority votes, but that doesn't always happen when it's split 4 ways. So the pink voters get no representation. In the 6th slide, you have, we're thinking in this slide of the Parti Bloc Québécois, where you get a concentration of voters of a particular political leaning, and they take the seat. And the pink voters, again, are disenfranchised. Their votes didn't really count for anything at all. Next.
Fantastic. So now that we understand first past the post a bit with that great graphic, we're going to go through and explain a few of the different problems associated with this and the impacts on our social and public health systems. So the first of these problems is the problem of distorted results, as Joyce has already covered really well in the slide with the pie charts. So here's a bit more detail on that. So as we can see from the 2015 election, despite earning only 39% of votes, 54% of seats were earned, and thus 100% of the power was consolidated by the Liberal Party. And the further sort of issue associated with this is the fact that all votes are not equal. As we saw in the previous slide, because the Yellow Party had concentrated support, they were able to win a riding, whereas the Orange Party, which had very diffuse support, was not able to win a single riding despite earning lots of votes. So we can see that here in the 2008 federal election, for example, in which the Greens received nearly 1 million votes and no seats. And the Bloc Québécois only several hundred thousand more votes, but 49 seats out of a total of 338, which is a very, very huge achievement to pull off for just one province of party. So the implications of this, as we know, is that progressive parties are getting squeezed out. They're underrepresented in proportion to the amount of progressive values held by the people of Canada and voters, whereas the sort of center right established parties are much more overrepresented in government. So next slide. So here's some impacts, I guess, of that system. So especially in the Ford government, we can see this. The Ford government, the Conservatives in the last provincial election, received only 40% of the votes, which is by no means democratically legitimate to be making these decisions, since 60% of the voters, wanted something at least slightly more progressive or much more progressive. So some of these cuts that we've seen, such as to Toronto Public Health, e-health and health policy research, cuts to women's shelters, these don't have much democratic legitimacy, with only decisions being made by a government that only received 40% of votes. Next slide. So the next problem we'll talk about is something that we're calling adversarial politics and the resulting impacts on policy. So policy lurch is a concept which describes the flip-flop of policy every term, in which the pendulum swings back and forth, usually from conservative to liberal in government. And even though there is a perception that majority governments get more done, and that's true within their term, they get a lot done. It's an extremely efficient way of governing. However, in the long view, that efficiency is much less when you consider that there's overturning of policies every few years when a term ends and another government or party comes to power. So that really sort of erodes that myth of efficiency when you consider that no policy legacy is in place for very long. Whereas if you had a system which was more collaborative, there would be better longevity of policies. Next slide. So a few examples of this and how it's impacted our health funding and social funding. A great one is UBI. So UBI was a really ambitious social policy undertaken by the previous Liberal government, which was canceled as soon as the Ford government came into power. That's a really exemplifies the flip-flopping on not only individual policies, but on sort of philosophies towards social and health policies as well. So the next problem, next slide, Michelle, thank you, is the concept of wasted votes. So under first past the post, as we can see from those diagrams earlier, everyone who cast a vote for what was the color we used? The red party, sorry. In our drafts, it was orange. So all of the votes cast for those red dots have not actually gone towards electing anyone. They were wasted votes in the sense that there's no governing power associated with those votes, which is a huge issue. And what this leads to is obviously the concept of strategic voting. I know probably many of you have heard of that, but just to give a bit of a coverage of it, it's when we feel the need to cast our vote for a party that's more electable within our riding, has a better chance of electoral success, because we feel like even though our own values might align with a smaller party like the NDP or the Greens, for instance, we feel that it would just be a wasted vote to cast for them, so we're not even going to bother. So we have a bit of a poll. I think Stephen's going to help facilitate that. Just asking, did you vote strategically in the last election? And we can vote yes, no, or if you're not sure, or it was more complicated than that. Great. I'm just curious, can everybody see the poll results as they're coming in?
I'll be able to share it at the end.
Okay, awesome.
After everyone has voted.
Okay, so we've received about 15 votes so far, so that's great. We'll give it a couple more seconds.
Yeah, I think I'll go ahead and share the poll.
Yeah, why don't you share it? Yeah.
Okay.
Great, so everybody can see. So we had 7 votes for yes, 8 votes for no, and 1 vote for not sure. So that's great to see so many people not voting strategically. That's wonderful. The problem is 7 votes is 7 votes too many for strategic voting, because we should all be entitled to choice within our system. We should feel empowered and able to vote for a party that best represents our interests in the system. Great. Okay, so close that poll. Great. So problem 4 that we want to cover is the lack of accountability that the first past the post system fosters within our democracy. And this is a lack of accountability on 2 dimensions. The first of these dimensions is a lack of accountability among voters, and also the fact that accountability is impossible when there's no choice in a system. It's very difficult for a party to feel the need to be accountable to voters, because when voters do not have a choice, an alternative, in a sense, they feel the votes are safe and they don't need to act in a way that's accountable to voters' interests or needs. The second kind of accountability is the kind that comes not just at the polls every 4 years, but within one term. And currently, I think, as we can sort of see from, let's say, the Liberals' first term, 2015 election to 2019 election, when one party has full power, and this, I guess Ford is actually a better example of this, but when one party has full power, they don't actually have to be accountable to anyone. They can make whatever choices they want. That's how our system works, and it is a very efficient one in some senses, as we've covered. But the sort of alternative to that would be collaboration-based governments, in which coalition party members or even a minority government system, the other parties are able to hold accountable the sort of governing party. So next slide. And the example of this that's pretty good is it's topical for this, it's the Liberal Party's promise on electoral reform. So obviously, as we saw, the Liberals campaigned on abolishing first past the post. That would be the last election run under that system. But for several reasons, they felt that that change, when they studied it, would not be in their interest, so they abandoned the promise. So they felt able to do this for two reasons, because they felt that voters would safely still vote for them in the 2019 election because they don't have a good alternative under our system. They feel pressured to vote Liberal rather than perhaps NDP or Green. And also within that, within their term, they don't have much accountability to other parties, such as, you know, we can see through committees, the party with a majority essentially rules the committee, which is also something we've seen throughout the scandal, and despite many Canadians wanting that investigated further, the Liberals have prevented that from happening. So next slide, this is just a summary of all the problems I've covered with first past the post. So we have party misrepresentation, which causes progressive parties to be squeezed out. Adversarial politics, which results in inefficient, unpredictable policy flip-flop. Wasted votes and the problem of strategic voting and voter apathy, which shouldn't be happening in a healthy democracy. And a lack of accountability that happens both with voters and within terms. So next slide. So the solution we have, we're going to explain the system of proportional representation, which probably a lot of you have already heard about, which is fantastic, but we're going to go into a bit of detail of how it works at a voting level. So next slide. So we call a voting system proportional when it's a pretty clear term, when the votes cast are proportional to the seats won. So this is just recalling the earlier pie charts we had on first past the post results. And we can see within each election, the distortion between votes cast and seats won. So just get a look at that. And then next slide, as we can see here, this is just better proportionality. And of course, it won't ever be 100% perfect down to the decimal point of votes cast to seats won, but it's a hell of a lot better. So we can see that this would have results that were proportional from votes cast to seats won. Next slide. So here's an example, an explanation of how PR works at the electoral level, at the riding level. And just as a disclaimer, there's actually several different ways to implement PR. It could be described best, I think, as a family of systems. So we've just picked a couple that we're going to demonstrate with through some graphics to help you understand. So here are our 6 ridings from before under first past the post. All the problems we've already identified still there. Next slide. So the first thing that we're going to do for our example, and this isn't necessarily mandatory, but we're doing this to sort of keep the level of ridings in Canada at 338. So the first thing we're going to do in our example is just merge those 6 ridings into 2 ridings. Next slide. So when we rearrange to group together those parties, we can see the blue party is still winning both of these ridings. So we haven't solved anything yet. Next slide. So, so this is, there are 2 systems we'll show you today. So this one is called a mixed member system. And that's exactly what it sounds like. We're going to be electing multiple members to represent each riding. In this case, the blue party gets 2 and the red party gets 1 from that first riding. And in the second one, blue, red, and yellow all get 1 each. So this is a way of balancing out those distortions that we saw earlier. We've been able to retain the principle of riding level representation, which is very important for our Canadian Federation. So on the next slide, we have a different system, which is also used all over the world. So this is called a mixed member system, and it works a little bit differently. So still there's only 1 riding level representative elected from each riding. And in this case, it is still a blue party for both. But in this concept, we're adding in more seats that are not associated with the riding per se. But usually the people elected from those will come from a party list just a list of names that will be elected based on votes for a party, in addition to votes cast for a riding. So in this case, red has received 2, blue 1 additional 1, and yellow also 1 seat. So this is a better way of helping to match up the seats won to the votes cast. Great. So just a summary, it's a PR is a great system for making the number of seats won correlate better to the votes cast. The system we've demonstrated would keep the number of ridings constant, but we can also add more seats to government if that was something that the people wanted. Great. So Joyce is going to now take over and talk about who uses PR.
Thanks, Megan. So who does use PR? Well, in fact, most countries, 85 countries. We've had a little look at the two systems, and you might be honing in on why the PR elected governments are doing better on the social determinants of health, because they reflect the values and needs of the majority. And that's one of the reasons that countries have chosen proportional representation, and some countries have moved to proportional representation. And I chose these 4 because they are former British colonies and protectorates. So they represent New Zealand, South Africa, Hong Kong, and Malta. And for your information, the first country to adopt proportional representation was Belgium in 1899, and the idea came from John Stuart Mill. So thank you. Next slide. Okay, evidence that the influence of left political parties is important to the developing and maintaining the welfare state is consistent with the Canadian experience. Medicare and public pensions came about during Lester Pearson's minority government, as we saw before. So the social determinants of health are basically determined by government policy. You know, the amount of money put towards social housing, to make sure that everybody has a square meal, like food programs in schools, regulations and laws that govern employment and working conditions, minimum wage, etc., money that goes to education. All of these relate very closely to the way Canadians live and the health level at which they're going to be able to operate in their lives and either thrive or not thrive. So next slide, please. And countries that use PR do better in the social determinants of health. They are basically more developed welfare states. Fewer people fall into poverty, and PR requires governments to consider all voices. So you get a balance in government, not just a party that if a party that just represents business and business development wins power, then you have a lack of balance for hearing the voices for the parties that are considering people maybe lower down on the income level and social scale at any given time. Next slide. 1 in 5 Canadian children live in poverty. Canada's rate of relative child poverty is 14%, 24th out of 35 industrialized countries. In other words, we're at the top of the bottom third. In contrast, of the top 15, 11 are countries that use PR. So this is one policy area where we know PR countries are doing better. Next slide. Canada stands out as one of the few Western nations that rely almost completely on market mechanism to supply, allocate, and maintain its housing stock. The market, through which 95% of Canadians obtain their housing, has not picked up the slack since the federal government froze funding for new public housing in 1994. Canada has one of the lowest percentages of social housing at 2%. And interestingly, the city of Vienna. In the city of Vienna, 80% of the population live in public housing. So, you know, it doesn't have to be this way. Next slide, please. Another area where PR countries do better is in the income gap. Of the top 16 countries with the lowest income gap, that gap between rich and poor, 13 of 16 are countries that use PR. The measure used is the Gini index, and it measures social inequality. Income gap is becoming increasingly worrying to countries because it tends to be associated with rising levels of crime and the rise of populist leaders. Next slide. Most of us would consider climate change the major health risk facing the planet. And I understand that's what your earlier session very much focused on. Therefore, a country's performance in addressing climate change deserves special attention. The CCPI ranks countries' efforts based on 14 indicators. Once again, the top performers are PR countries. Canada ranked very low. That's why Canada has fallen behind in the social determinants of health. The progressive parties are disadvantaged by the electoral system, so you can see electoral reform is a large issue affecting our performance on these very, very basic social determinants of health. Next slide.
Great. So thank you so much, Joyce. So just to recap, we're going to tell you just how PR solves all the problems we identified earlier. So firstly, parties would be represented proportionally, which means that progressive parties who have a tendency to be more supportive of social funding and health funding would have more representation in our centers of decision making. Secondly, a more collaborative style of politics would lead to longevity of policies, which is something extremely important when we consider the importance of sustainability throughout our funding of social and health systems. Third, every vote would count. We wouldn't have to strategically vote anymore. And fourth, accountability would be not only more effective when it comes to election time, but also an ongoing process between elections within terms. So next slide, yep. So just to wrap up, basically, if you are wondering if there's any actions you can take on PR, we will be sharing this slide deck, so you don't have to worry about copying anything down, but there will be links embedded in this slide so that you can basically go to some websites, learn more and about how you could possibly write a letter to your provincial or federal representative to let them know about the importance of PR to health and social funding. You can also find us on social medias at the links that you'll be able to click on to learn more about helping with PR. So with that concludes our presentation, and we'd love to open the floor up to questions before we start discussions in breakout rooms. So please, if there's any questions, feel free to unmute or pop them in the chat. We would love to answer them.
I have a question, if that's okay. I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to word it. Just in terms of just like wanting to understand all of the information about proportional representation, are there any shortcomings we should be aware of that are unique to proportional representation and isn't one of both proportional representation and first past the post?
That's a great question. Michelle or Jesse, or Joyce, do you have any thoughts on that? Because I know, when Trudeau was sort of reviewing the different options, I think there was some, personally, I think there was some misinformation in his reviewing of the options that led to sort of a negative publicity for PR, which is really too bad because I personally don't agree with what he identified to be pitfalls as something that would be really happening. But the one he identified, I don't know if I should repeat it because I don't think it's true, but he said the fear with PR is that it would give power to fringe parties that could be dangerous and they could rise to power somehow and destroy our democracy. Don't agree with that. Joyce, do you want to take over? Yeah.
Yes. Often, you know, people, there's absolutely no justification for first past the post, because, you know, they obviously, you know, everyone, I think, many people believe that we actually do have proportional representation. They're quite surprised when you tell them, no, actually Ford only won 40% of the vote. The majority of us are not represented in decision making. No, there really is no justification for it. So they go after fear, basically fear things like fringe parties. You know, like are the Greens a fringe party? There's and along with that argument, for example, is that, well, a party that was in a minority position might join up with a fringe party and pass like really radical policies just in order to get that fringe party's support for their legislation. But there's the built-in barrier for that is that the bigger party is not going to want to jeopardize its whole base of voters and do something radical, you know, to pass one piece of legislation. So there's checks and balances within proportional representation. The other one that's interesting to me is that they supporters of first past the post will say it's stable. But when you look at policy, Lurch, is it really stable when you're throwing away like 122 billion on green energy, breaking green energy contracts that were set by the previous government? I mean, that's not stable. That's a waste, huge waste of the resources of the taxpayers of Ontario. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that word stability needs to be defined pretty closely. So, you know, I'd say just, you know, look very closely at the criticisms, and you know, Fair Vote Canada is calling for a citizens' assembly on electoral reform. So obviously, it's very important that we choose the right system for Canada or the right system for Ontario, and build it and design it very carefully. So that's, you know, that's sort of in summary my answer.
Yeah, so just want to, if there are any other questions, I want to address this before we go to breakout rooms. Like, is everybody good with the concepts? Give a little thumbs up if we're good with the concepts. Okay, awesome. So, so Stephen has it set up that we'll split into breakout rooms. Just in the interest of time, maybe, Stephen, is it possible for those to be 8 minutes instead of 10? Awesome. So here are some of the questions. We'll repeat them. So the facilitators of each of the breakout rooms be myself, Joyce, and Jesse. But what we're going to talk about is we want to hear from you about what your area of public health research is, or even just what your interests are when it comes to different policies associated with health, and start a conversation about how PR could possibly lead to better outcomes in those domains. Great. So yeah, let's break out. 120 seconds is a long time.
You know, if it's, I'd just like to add something to what we were talking about in our breakout room. Fantastic. And that is that prior to the pandemic, and just after the Ford government took power, they cut the mandatory inspection in long-term care homes. Mm-hmm. And that contributed in a big way to the outcomes for elderly people in those homes, and the number of people, close to 2,000, I believe, just in Ontario, who died from that. And it was done seemingly for just ideological reasons. There was no research supporting it at all. It was just a cost-cutting measure, and I think that's something that that might be avoided. In answer to your question, Megan, might have been avoided had we had PR in Ontario.
Mm-hmm. So for everyone just joining us back from the breakout rooms, what John was just talking about is something we were talking about in our breakout room, which is how things might have been handled differently throughout COVID in Ontario if instead of a Ford government elected by only 40% of the voters, we had, for instance, a coalition or collaborative-based government that was a coalition of perhaps NDP, Green, and Liberals who received the other 60% of the votes. So is there anyone else who wanted to share something interesting that they chatted about in their breakout room? We only have a few minutes, but we'd love to hear. Jesse or Joyce, anything from you guys?
Yeah, I can kind of summarize one of the kind of interesting things that came up. I think people being stuck at home with the pandemic has allowed people a little bit more time to think and also engage with their local community a little bit more. Maybe they're not commuting quite as much and kind of keep connected with that. And so there was some talk about how that's led to people maybe discussing more ideas in a more civil way and becoming a little bit more engaged in politics. And I think that's kind of spurred a lot of the conversations that we're having right now with the electoral reform down south as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. I think we all have so much, well, depending on our situation, some of us have more time to mull things over politically, yeah. Joyce, we're just sharing things from breakout rooms, but if anyone else wants to share something they talked about, please go ahead. Joyce?
Yeah, we had the opportunity to offer to do a workshop for any organization that one of our breakout room members could think of or was associated with in Hamilton. We used to do slideshows by going to community centers or schools or wherever anybody wanted to hear about PR. Now we're doing it on Zoom. So we do that. That is something that that Fair Vote Canada does. If you have an organization that you're associated with that you think could benefit from hearing something like this presentation. So that came up in our breakout room.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So it is 11:58, so we're running short on time. So on behalf of Fair Vote Toronto and those joining us from today, I just want to say thank you everybody for joining today and talking with us about this really important issue. So Fair Vote Toronto is a totally volunteer-run organization, and we're always looking for helpers, volunteers with the organization, and people to help out with the individual actions that we launch on our social media accounts. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that you've learned something and taken something away about our political system.
I'm just going to share our last slide. So we would like to thank you all for attending this session with the discussion of Healthy Society Needs a Healthy Democracy. We ask you to please fill out the short evaluation that probably has popped up on your Zoom screen. Our next session is Meet the Sponsors. So you can join us. I think that is at 12:10. Our sponsors are the MAP Center for Urban Health Resources or Research, Access Alliance, and the Alliance for Healthier Communities. After, there will be a panel for discussion on the politics of data, and links for all of these sessions can be found within your participant package. And again, we just want to thank all of the attendees as well as our speakers today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lauren.
Thank you so much, guys.
Yikes.
That was a fantastic workshop. Thank you so much for
Thank you, Stephen.
sharing all of that.
Thank you. I'm loving these poll results.
Yeah, good to see. I know. I realized halfway through I was intending to stop to allow for questions after explaining PR, and I totally slipped my mind. But anyway, I hope it was okay, and everyone just didn't have questions because it made sense.
I think it was. Sorry, go ahead, Stephen.
No, go on.
It was really nice to do the breakouts to kind of have that smaller cohort discussion with everyone, so everyone could kind of ask their questions then, which I found was really nice as well.
Yeah, I find in big groups, just most people